The salesman does not mean to be unkind. That is the thing Marcus Hale remembers most clearly about the interaction. Years later, when he has enough distance from it to evaluate it fairly, rather than through the particular sensitivity of a 22-year-old who has just been laughed at in a place of business by someone who was supposed to be trying to sell him something. The salesman is not a cruel man. He is a man who has spent 15 years on a dealership floor evaluating customers by the signals that dealership floors train you to read: the truck they drove in, the clothes they are wearing, the way they hold themselves when they walk through the door, the specific hesitation or confidence with which they approach the equipment on the lot. Marcus drives a truck that is 11 years old and has primer showing on the passenger door where the paint was repaired incorrectly by a previous owner. He is wearing work clothes that are clean but not new. He is 22 years old and does not yet have the particular physical authority that comes to men who have been doing physical work for decades, the settled weight of accumulated labor that signals to someone reading customers on a dealership floor that this is a person who knows what he is doing and who has the resources to act on that knowledge. Marcus does not have that yet. He has the knowledge, more of it than the salesman will discover, because the conversation does not get far enough for it to become relevant. But the knowledge is not visible from the outside in the way that the truck and the clothes and the age are visible, and the salesman reads what is visible and makes the assessment that 15 years of dealership floor experience has trained him to make, which turns out to be wrong in every respect that eventually matters. Marcus tells the salesman he is looking to build a grain farming operation and that he intends to start with a used Massey Ferguson tractor he has identified at a private sale in the next county. He says he wants to discuss what his equipment needs will look like as the operation scales and whether the dealership can be a resource for that growth. The salesman's response is not a formal laugh, not the kind that is intended as a social signal and that can be apologized for in the moment. It is the brief, involuntary sound that escapes when a person encounters a statement that their current understanding of the situation makes seem genuinely incongruous. A 22-year-old in a primer-spotted truck telling a dealership salesman he's going to build a grain operation around a used tractor purchased at a private sale is incongruous with the profile of a serious equipment customer in the way that the salesman's experience has defined what serious equipment customers look like. The sound escapes. The salesman recovers immediately and says something professionally courteous about being happy to discuss the dealership's used inventory, pivoting toward a transaction that fits the profile he has assigned rather than the conversation Marcus came to have. Marcus does not correct the pivot or extend the conversation. He thanks the salesman for his time, which takes approximately 40 seconds, and walks back out to his 11-year-old truck and drives to the farm where the private sale tractor is waiting. Marcus Hale did not grow up on a farm. This is the fact about his background that people find most surprising when they learn it later, after the operation has grown to a scale where the background becomes interesting rather than incongruous. His father worked maintenance at a grain elevator in a small town in the eastern part of the state, and Marcus spent his childhood summers working at the elevator alongside his father, handling grain, maintaining equipment, doing the physical work that an elevator operation requires from anyone who shows up willing to do it at the rates a small-town elevator pays for summer labor. He learned machinery at the elevator not because anyone set out to teach him, but because he was curious, and the machinery was there, and the older men who maintained it were the kind of men who answered genuine questions from a young person who is paying real attention rather than performing interest. He learned Perkins engines because one of the elevator's receiving augers ran a Perkins, and the maintenance man who kept it running was willing to let Marcus watch, and eventually to let Marcus help, and eventually to let Marcus do the work while the maintenance man watched. He learned hydraulic systems because the elevator's leg equipment used hydraulic tensioning that needed regular attention, and that the maintenance man explained in the direct way of a man who believes that understanding why something works is as important as knowing how to make it work. Marcus graduated high school with a mechanical knowledge base that was broader and more practically grounded than most 22-year-olds who have grown up in agricultural communities with equipment all around them and with a specific and carefully considered plan for what he intended to do with it. The plan is straightforward in its outline and demanding in its execution, which is the characteristic of most plans that work over a long period. Marcus intends to start farming rented ground, starting with whatever acreage he can access on the basis of his labor, his mechanical capability, and whatever reputation he can build in the first 2 seasons before he has a track record long enough to speak for itself in the conversations with landowners that determine who gets to rent what ground and at what rate in a rural land market that runs almost entirely on relationships and demonstrated reliability. He intends to do this with the minimum viable equipment set that can actually perform the required field operations, buying used and paying cash, and maintaining everything himself. He intends to grow the operation only as fast as the cash flow from the operation itself supports, without equipment financing that creates fixed obligations independent of what the farming generates, and without operating line debt beyond what a single season's crop can retire from the proceeds of that season's sales. He has written this plan down, not in a format that he has shown to anyone, not in a business plan document of the kind that a banker would request if Marcus were the kind of person who walked into banks asking for startup capital, which he is not, because he knows what banks say to 22-year-olds without collateral who want to start farming operations, and he has not wasted anyone's time, including his own, by having that conversation. The Massey Ferguson 4255 he buys at the private sale is 11 years old, has hours on it that reflect a working farm life but not an abused one, and is mechanically sound in the ways that matter most, which Marcus confirms not through a dealer inspection or a third-party assessment, but through 2 hours of his own examination that covers every system he knows how to evaluate, and that produces a list of known items requiring attention and a set of conclusions about the systems he cannot fully evaluate without running the machine under load. He pays the asking price without negotiating, not because he lacks the negotiating instinct, but because he has evaluated the price against the regional market for comparable machines, and the asking price is fair. And negotiating a fair price downward is not a thing Marcus spends energy on, because the energy is better spent on the work. He brings the 4255 home on a borrowed trailer, which is the only piece of the transaction that required borrowing anything, and spends the following week going through it in the bay of a rented machine shed that he has secured on a month-to-month basis from a retired farmer 2 miles from the first parcel of ground he has lined up to rent. The first parcel is 240 acres, cash rent, owned by a man named Harold Steen, whose previous tenant had let the ground slide in a way that was visible in the soil test results and in the drainage patterns and in the weed pressure that Harold's fields were carrying when Marcus drove every road adjacent to the property before approaching Harold about the lease. Marcus did not approach Harold about the lease by calling him. He approached Harold by showing up at the property on a Saturday morning when Harold was checking his drainage tile after a wet spell, introducing himself directly and having a conversation about the ground that demonstrated within the first 10 minutes that Marcus had done his preparation and knew what he was looking at and had a specific plan for what he intended to do with it. Harold Steen is 68 years old and has been renting his ground to other operators for 7 years, since his own health required him to step back from active farming, and he has learned in those 7 years to evaluate prospective tenants on the basis of how they talk about the ground, rather than how they talk about their equipment or their operation, because a man who talks about the ground specifically and correctly is a man who intends to farm it rather than mine it. And Harold's distinction between farming and mining ground is the primary criterion he applies to anyone who wants to rent from him. Marcus talks about the ground specifically and correctly. Harold rents to him. The first season is the season that defines everything that follows, not because it goes perfectly. It does not go perfectly, because first seasons do not go perfectly, and Marcus is not under any illusion that his will be the exception, but because it goes well enough on the metrics that matter and badly enough on the metrics that teach. The Ford 255 runs without significant mechanical incident through the planting season, which is the outcome that Marcus's pre-purchase assessment and his week of preseason preparation were designed to produce, and which is not a surprise, but is a relief in the way that any planned outcome is a relief when it actually occurs rather than simply being planned. The crop establishes correctly. The herbicide application, which Marcus does himself with a boom sprayer he built from components purchased at 2 farm sales and assembled over a winter weekend, goes on at the right timing and produces the weed control his program requires. The harvest is custom hired, which is the one operational concession Marcus makes in his first season on the basis of equipment capital that has not yet accumulated to the point where a combine purchase is financially sound. And the custom operation performs adequately, if not on the exact schedule Marcus would prefer. The yield comes in above his break-even on the rented acres. The operating account at the end of the first season is positive. It is not dramatically positive. It is positive in the way that first seasons tend to be positive for operators who have planned correctly and worked hard and had weather that cooperated with the planting and growing calendar without cooperating so generously that it obscures the operational decisions that either worked or did not work. Marcus adds ground in his second season. Not as much as some people in his position would add, because Marcus's criterion for adding ground is not the maximum that his current equipment can cover, but the maximum that his current equipment can cover while being maintained to the standard he requires, which is a lower number than the theoretical maximum and a more sustainable one. He adds one additional parcel, 200 acres, rented from a landowner he met at an elevator meeting in the fall of his first season, and he approaches the second season with a 2-parcel, 440-acre operation that requires the 4,255 to work harder than the first season, but not beyond what Marcus's maintenance discipline and operational scheduling can support. The second season builds on the first, in the way that well-executed second seasons build on well-executed first seasons, which is by extending the demonstration of reliability that landowners and suppliers and the general agricultural community in the area are beginning to observe and to mention to each other in the way that rural communities mention things that deviate from expectation, which is consistently and with more attention than the person being discussed is generally aware of. By his 5th season, Marcus is farming 900 acres, has purchased a second Massey Ferguson tractor with cash from the accumulated operating surplus of the previous 4 seasons, and has bought a used combine that he went through completely in the winter before his 5th harvest, and that has not required anything beyond scheduled maintenance in the 2 seasons since. He has not borrowed money for any of it. He has not borrowed money for any equipment purchase, any input purchase, or any operational expense since the day he drove away from Harold Steen's field with a lease agreement and a plan that a dealership salesman had briefly and involuntarily found incongruous. The operating account grows each year by a margin that is modest in absolute terms and significant in structural terms, because it grows without any portion of it being redirected to service debt that was incurred to produce it, which is the financial characteristic of an equipment strategy built around cash purchase and maintenance discipline that compounds differently from an equipment strategy built around financing and trading cycles. Harold Steen watches Marcus farm his ground for 5 seasons before he says something about it directly, which is in the way of an older man who takes his time forming opinions about people, but who forms them thoroughly when he does. He tells Marcus at the end of the 5th season that the ground is in the best condition it has been in since Harold farmed it himself, which is the highest compliment Harold Steen is in a position to offer, and which Marcus receives in the way it is offered, seriously and without false modesty. Harold asks Marcus whether he is interested in adding the second parcel Harold owns, which has been rented to a different operator whose lease is expiring and whom Harold has decided, on the basis of the ground's condition at the end of the current lease, not to renew. Marcus says he is interested. They agree on terms the same afternoon, which is how Harold Steen does business with people he has been watching for 5 years and whose judgment and reliability he has formed a thorough opinion about. The dealership where Marcus was briefly laughed at by a salesman who was reading signals that turned out to be wrong closes in Marcus's 8th season of farming, a casualty of the consolidation that has been moving through the agricultural equipment retail sector for years, and that has taken a particular toll on smaller single-location dealerships that lack the service network and the parts inventory and the financing relationships that the larger regional operations can offer. Marcus drives past the empty lot on the way to pick up a parts order from a different supplier and does not spend much time thinking about it. The salesman who laughed is not his adversary and never was. The laugh was a misread of available information by a man whose information was genuinely limited to what a primer-spotted truck and a work jacket communicated to someone who had been reading those signals for 15 years. Marcus was not an obvious customer for a dealership in his 22nd year. He is an obvious customer for a dealership now, in his 12th year, with 3,000 acres under management and a fleet of Massey Ferguson equipment that he has assembled over a decade, through cash purchases at estate sales and private transactions, and the occasional dealer-used inventory when the right machine at the right price presented itself through that channel. The 3,000 acres does not belong to Marcus. He owns a portion of it, 2 parcels he has purchased over the past 4 years, using accumulated operating capital from the farming operation rather than agricultural land financing, and he rents the remainder from 8 different landowners across the county and the adjacent one, each of whom chose Marcus over other prospective tenants on the basis of the same criteria Harold Steen applied 12 years ago, which is how the man talks about the ground and what the ground looks like after he has been farming it. Marcus's reputation in the county's agricultural land rental market is the reputation of a man who farms ground the way it should be farmed, and who maintains equipment the way it should be maintained, and who pays his rent on the first of the month and handles his agronomic decisions with the same discipline he applies to his financial ones. It is not a flashy reputation. It does not generate the kind of attention that a large new equipment purchase generates when the truck comes down the road and the neighbors watch from their lanes. It generates the kind of attention that causes landowners to call Marcus when a parcel becomes available before they call anyone else, which is the only kind of attention that matters in a farming operation built the way Marcus has built his. The Massey Ferguson 4255 that started it all is still on the farm. It is not the primary tractor anymore. That role belongs to a larger machine purchased 4 seasons ago to handle the tillage and planting work that the operation's scale now requires. But it is not retired either, because retiring a functional machine is not something Marcus does when the machine is not asking to be retired. It handles the secondary work, the loader operation in the yard, the grain auger duty during bin filling, the chemical nurse tank pulling, the odd jobs that a utility tractor handles on a large grain operation that could theoretically be done with the larger equipment, but that are more efficiently and less expensively done with a smaller machine that does not burn the fuel or create the compaction risk that the large machine creates when it is operating in confined spaces or on ground that does not need its weight. The 4255 is 23 years old under Marcus's ownership. It has been through everything that a machine goes through across 23 seasons of working farm use, and it has come through all of it because Marcus has never allowed it to accumulate the deferred maintenance that is the actual cause of most machine failures that get attributed to age or hours or the general category of a machine being worn out. A machine that is worn out is usually a machine that was allowed to wear out, which is a different thing from a machine that has simply been used for a long time. Marcus does not talk about the dealership visit from his 22nd year in any public way. He mentions it occasionally in private conversation to people he knows well enough to tell it to, without the telling becoming something other than what it is, which is an honest account of a moment that was briefly painful and that turned out to be useful in the specific way that moments of dismissal can be useful when the person being dismissed is paying attention to the right things. The salesman read the signals that were available and made the assessment those signals supported. Marcus went and did the thing the salesman had briefly found incongruous, and did it for 12 years, until the thing was no longer incongruous to anyone, and then kept doing it for another decade after that, because the approach that built the operation in the first 12 years is the same approach that maintains it in the decade after, which is to buy used equipment with cash, maintain it completely, run it until the economics of running it change, and spend every dollar that would otherwise go to financing costs and trading losses on the ground, and the inputs and the agronomic decisions that actually determine what a farming operation produces. The dealership is gone. The 4255 is in the shed. The 3,000 acres are going into their 13th season under Marcus Hale's management. The farm journal, which Marcus has kept since the first season, the way his instinct for documentation told him to keep it, has 13 years of entries that tell the story of what the approach produced and what it cost and what it is worth. He does not need to show it to anyone. The ground tells the same story in a language that every landowner who has ever let Marcus farm their acres can read, without any help from a journal, which is the language of soil that has been treated correctly and returned in better condition than it was received, season after season, by a man who started with a used Massey Ferguson and a plan that a dealership salesman briefly found incongruous on a Tuesday afternoon 12 years ago, and that turned out, in the way that well-made plans sometimes do, to be exactly right.